Imagine a man starving to death, surrounded by food. Not just any food, but a treasure trove of potential harvests, the largest and most diverse collection of edible plants the world had ever seen. He is in a prison, cell number 113, in the city of Saratov. His body is swollen from hunger. His muscles have wasted away. He is Nikolai Vavilov, a titan of biology, a man who traveled over 500,000 kilometers across 5 continents, risking his life in deserts and mountains, all to gather the genetic library that could end famine forever. He collected 250,000 seeds, tubers, and fruits, creating the world's first global seed bank. And now, in the winter of 1943, in the heart of the Soviet Union, the very nation he dedicated his life to feeding, he is dying of starvation. Why? Why would a nation desperate for food, a nation that had seen millions perish in the famines of the Holodomor, systematically persecute, imprison, and starve its most brilliant agricultural scientist? The answer isn't a simple matter of political paranoia or bureaucratic cruelty. The answer has a name. It is the name of the man who sent Vavilov to his death, a man who held no advanced degrees, who barely understood the science he claimed to command, but who, for 30 years, held Soviet biology and agriculture in an iron grip. His name was Trofim Denisovich Lysenko, and his story is a terrifying parable of how, in the crucible of desperation and ideology, a single charismatic man's war on reality can starve a nation, execute its brightest minds, and cripple its future for generations. This isn't just a story about bad science. It's a story about how easily a lie can take root when people are desperate enough to believe it. Our story begins not in a prison, but in the vast, windswept fields of Ukraine in the late 1920s. The Soviet Union is young, volatile, and starving. Lenin's successor, a former seminary student with a will of steel named Joseph Stalin, has launched a monumental and brutal campaign, the collectivization of agriculture. He has declared war on the kulaks, the so-called wealthy peasants, seizing their land, their grain, their livestock, and forcing millions onto vast state-run farms. The result is a catastrophe of biblical proportions. Fields lie fallow. Experienced farmers are shot or deported to the gulag. An entire class of people who understood the ancient, intimate rhythms of the land is liquidated. The state, run by theorists and bureaucrats, proves spectacularly inept at farming. Famine descends. We call it the Holodomor. In Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe, people eat grass, tree bark, and leather. The silence of villages where children no longer play hangs heavy in the air. Millions die. Stalin needs a miracle. He needs it now. The grand Soviet experiment, the promise of a worker's paradise, is threatening to collapse into a mass grave. He doesn't have time for the slow, methodical work of traditional science, the kind practiced by men like Nikolai Vavilov. Vavilov and his colleagues were geneticists. They studied the new, complex science of Gregor Mendel and Thomas Hunt Morgan. They spoke of genes, of dominant and recessive traits, of the patient, years-long process of crossbreeding plants to create more resilient and productive strains. To Stalin, this was intellectual nonsense. It was slow, it was complicated, and worst of all, it was bourgeois. The idea that an organism's potential was locked away in its genes, predetermined and difficult to change, smacked of fatalism. It didn't fit with the revolutionary spirit of the Soviet Union. The idea that a new Soviet man could be forged, that society and even nature itself could be radically and rapidly transformed by sheer willpower and correct ideology. And into that vacuum of desperation and ideological hunger stepped Trofim Lysenko. He didn't look like a scientist. He was a peasant, born and raised. He had dirt under his fingernails and the confident, homespun manner of a man of the soil. He was what the party desperately wanted to believe in, a barefoot scientist, a prodigy of the proletariat. In 1927, a state newspaper ran a glowing article about him. Lysenko, working at a remote experimental station in Azerbaijan, had apparently discovered a way to grow a winter crop of peas in the frost-bitten fields, feeding the local population through the harsh winter. It was a sensation. Here was a man of the people, achieving practical results while the academic scientists in their ivory towers were muttering about invisible things called chromosomes. What was his revolutionary technique? He called it vernalization. The name was grand, scientific sounding. The method was deceptively simple. Lysenko claimed that by soaking seeds in ice-cold water before planting, you could shock them, altering their very nature and changing them from a winter variety to a spring variety. You could, he argued, train a plant. You could teach it to bend to the will of the collective. To a real biologist, this was confusing. Treating a seed with cold to stimulate germination was a known practice, but Lysenko wasn't just talking about germination. He was claiming he could rewrite the fundamental hereditary nature of the plant. He was proposing that characteristics acquired during an organism's life could be passed down to its offspring. A plant trained to withstand cold would produce seeds that were also resistant to cold. This was an old, discredited idea known as Lamarckism. It was the biological equivalent of saying that if a blacksmith develops strong arms from hammering steel, his children will be born with stronger arms. The entire field of modern genetics, built on the work of Mendel, had proven this to be false. Heredity was carried in the genes, a blueprint that wasn't altered by the life experiences of the parent. But Lysenko didn't care about Mendel. In fact, he was openly hostile to him. He dismissed genetics as a reactionary, bourgeois pseudoscience. He called geneticists fly lovers and people haters, mocking them for their meticulous experiments with fruit flies in university laboratories while the people starved. His rhetoric was pure political genius. He framed the debate not in scientific terms, but in ideological ones. Genetics, with its focus on immutable inheritance, was capitalist thinking. It implied a natural aristocracy, a fixed hierarchy. It was rigid and pessimistic. His theory, which he began to call Maturianism, after a Russian horticulturist he admired, was socialist. It was dynamic, optimistic, revolutionary. It suggested that nature, like people, could be re-educated, transformed, and perfected through struggle and willpower. He was offering a version of biology that perfectly mirrored communist doctrine. It was simple, it was bold, and it promised immediate results. Stalin loved it. Here was a man who spoke his language. Lysenko didn't ask for decades of funding for arcane research. He promised bumper crops next season. He didn't talk about complex probabilities. He talked about Soviet power transforming nature itself. In 1935, Stalin attended a conference of collective farm shock workers. Lysenko took the stage. He was not a polished speaker, but he had a raw populist charisma. He denounced his academic rivals as wreckers and saboteurs, enemies of the people who were intentionally holding back Soviet agriculture. At the end of his fiery speech, Stalin stood up and declared, "Bravo, Comrade Lysenko, bravo! In your simple words, you have demonstrated the bankruptcy of the old science and the triumph of the new." It was a coronation. With that single endorsement, Lysenko was no longer just a crank. He was a prophet. His word was now doctrine. The state propaganda machine roared to life. Newspapers and radio hailed him as the savior of Soviet agriculture. His portrait, with his intense gaze and determined jaw, were everywhere. For the real scientists of the Soviet Union, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Imagine you're a biologist in Moscow in 1936. You have dedicated your life to the study of genetics. You have read the international papers. You understand the elegant mathematics of heredity. You know with absolute certainty that Lysenko's ideas are nonsense. They are magical thinking. But now, your university's curriculum is being rewritten. Your textbooks are being banned. Your colleagues are starting to disappear in the middle of the night. To question Lysenko is no longer a scientific disagreement. It is a political crime. It is to question Stalin himself. Lysenko, now wielding immense power as the head of the Lenin All-Union Academy of Agricultural Sciences, Voskhnil, unleashed a reign of terror. It was a purge of the mind. Scientists were forced to stand up in public meetings and renounce their life's work. They were made to confess their Mendelist-Morganist errors and pledge allegiance to Maturinist biology. Refusal meant the loss of your job. It meant public condemnation as an enemy of the people. And for hundreds, it meant a knock on the door from the NKVD, the secret police. The charge was always the same: sabotage, wrecking. You were accused of intentionally promoting fascist science to starve the Soviet people. The irony was so cruel it was surreal. The very people who held the knowledge to actually prevent starvation were being executed for causing it. Nikolai Vavilov was Lysenko's greatest prize and his most hated enemy. Vavilov was everything Lysenko was not: internationally respected, scientifically rigorous, a true intellectual giant. He ran a global network of research stations. He was the living embodiment of the bourgeois science that Lysenko sought to destroy. For years, Vavilov tried to fight back. He used his influence, he argued rationally, he defended his colleagues. He believed, naively, that reason would eventually prevail. He underestimated the ferocity of ideology. In the Soviet Union of the late 1930s, facts were a liability. Lysenko laid a trap. In 1939, he publicly challenged Vavilov, accusing him of wasting state resources and promoting foreign anti-Soviet ideas. Vavilov defended himself and his science with dignity, but the outcome was preordained. The crowd, stacked with Lysenko's supporters, jeered him. He was a man armed with logic in a knife fight. In August 1940, while on a plant collecting expedition in western Ukraine, still working, still trying to save his country, Vavilov was arrested. The charges were absurd: that he was a leader of a secret anti-Soviet party of right-wing intellectuals, that he was a spy for England, that he had deliberately sabotaged Soviet agriculture. His interrogation was brutal. Over 400 hours of it. He was starved, beaten, denied sleep. In July 1941, he was sentenced to death. The sentence was later commuted to 20 years in the Gulag, but it was a death sentence all the same. He was sent to the prison in Saratov, where the man who had gathered the world's greatest defense against hunger would slowly, agonizingly starve. Meanwhile, Lysenko's revolutionary methods were being implemented across the entire Soviet Union, an area covering 1/6 of the Earth's landmass. The results were not just disappointing, they were apocalyptic. His vernalization technique, applied on a massive scale, often failed, as the trained seeds were not in fact hereditarily different and died in unexpected frosts. He ordered farmers to plant seeds incredibly close together in dense clusters. His reasoning was in a socialist society, plants wouldn't compete with each other for resources. They would work together for the common good. The reality, of course, is that plants, like all living things, compete for light, water, and nutrients. The fields planted using Lysenko's method became a tangled mess of choked, stunted stalks that produced a fraction of a normal yield. He ordered the mass planting of trees in the arid steppes of southern Russia to change the climate, a plan that ignored all ecological principles and resulted in the death of millions of saplings. He promoted all sorts of bizarre agricultural concoctions and techniques, each one announced with grand fanfare and each one ending in failure. But in the twisted logic of the totalitarian state, the failure was never the fault of the theory. The theory was perfect because it was ideologically correct. Therefore, the failure must be the fault of the people implementing it. When the clustered crops failed, it was because saboteurs and wreckers had undermined the project. When the vernalized wheat withered, it was because class enemies had planted the wrong seeds. More farmers and local officials were arrested. More scapegoats were found. The cycle of lies, failure, and terror intensified. While the West was entering the Green Revolution, using the very genetic science that Vavilov had championed to create high-yield crops that would feed billions, the Soviet Union was being dragged back into an agricultural dark age. The nation that prided itself on its scientific materialism was being run on principles that were closer to medieval alchemy. It was like trying to build a nuclear reactor using instructions from a book on magic spells. The peak of this madness, the absolute zenith of Lysenko's power, came in August 1948. Stalin, seeking to finally stamp out all remaining dissent, organized a special session of the Vaskhnil Agricultural Academy. It was a show trial for an entire branch of science. Lysenko took the podium. He was at the height of his power, arrogant and utterly confident. He railed against the Mendelist Morganists, the last brave geneticists who still dared to whisper the truth in the hallways. He declared their science a tool of American imperialists and race theorists. Then, for his grand finale, he played his trump card. He leaned into the microphone and said, "The party's Central Committee has reviewed my report and has approved it."
A stunned silence fell over the hall. Then, pandemonium. It was over. He had just announced publicly that his biological theories were now the official, unchallengeable position of the Communist Party. He had Stalin's direct blessing. To oppose Lysenkoism was now officially treason. Scientists rose, one by one, to recant. Men who had privately called Lysenko a charlatan now praised his genius. It was a scene of utter intellectual and moral collapse. Genetics was formally banned. Laboratories were destroyed. Textbooks were burned. Thousands more scientists were fired. Biology in the Soviet Union was effectively dead. And Lysenko? He was a hero. He was awarded the Order of Lenin 8 times. He was made a hero of socialist labor. He controlled appointments, funding, and publications. He was the undisputed dictator of Soviet science. A peasant with a primary school education had successfully purged the nation's greatest scientific minds and replaced science with dogma. But reality has a way of asserting itself. You can execute a geneticist, but you cannot execute a gene. You can outlaw the laws of heredity, but you cannot repeal them. While Lysenko sat in his grand office in Moscow, the harvests continued to fail. The soil degradation worsened. The Soviet Union, a country with some of the most fertile land on the planet, was forced to spend its precious gold reserves importing grain from its capitalist enemies in America and Canada just to feed its people. The lie was becoming too expensive to maintain. Stalin's death in 1953 began the slow thaw. His successor, Nikita Khrushchev, was a true believer in Lysenko at first. He was also a pragmatist who was genuinely horrified by the state of Soviet agriculture. He traveled to Iowa and was stunned by the productivity of American corn farms, all of it based on the hybrid corn developed through the genetic science that Lysenko had banned. The whispers against Lysenko grew louder. Physicists, who were the new untouchable elite of Soviet science due to their work on the atomic bomb, began to speak out. They understood that a lie in biology was a threat to truth in all sciences. The Nobel laureate, Andrei Sakharov, father of the Soviet hydrogen bomb, publicly denounced Lysenko as a disgrace. Slowly, painfully, the facade began to crack. Biologists, long silenced, began to cautiously republish their work. The stories of the purged scientists, of Vavilov and his hundreds of murdered colleagues, began to circulate. Lysenko fought back viciously, using his remaining political connections, but his power was waning. The final blow came in 1964 when Khrushchev was ousted. The new leadership under Brezhnev had no personal loyalty to the aging charlatan. They just saw the disastrous results. Lysenko was finally, quietly removed from power. His institutes were dismantled. He was stripped of his authority. He lived out the rest of his life in relative obscurity on an experimental farm near Moscow, a relic of a bygone era of terror. He died in 1976, still reportedly convinced of his own theories, a man who had built his kingdom on a lie and could not bear to see it fall. The damage he left behind is almost impossible to quantify. It's not just in the millions who may have died in the recurring famines his policies exacerbated. It's not just in the ruined landscapes and the crippled economy. The deepest wound was to the Russian mind itself. For 30 decades, an entire nation was taught that ideology was superior to evidence, that political convenience could rewrite natural law, that truth was whatever the man in power said it was. He destroyed the careers of over 3,000 mainstream biologists. He crippled the study of biology and agriculture so severely that Russia has, in many ways, still not fully recovered. And what of Nikolai Vavilov? He was officially rehabilitated after Stalin's death. His name was cleared, his books were reprinted, and streets and institutes were named after him. A hollow posthumous victory. But perhaps his greatest legacy, his silent testament, lies in St. Petersburg. During the horrific 900-day siege of Leningrad in World War II, as the city starved and people resorted to cannibalism, a small group of Vavilov scientists locked themselves inside his seed bank. They were surrounded by tons of edible material, rice, wheat, corn, potatoes, but they refused to touch a single grain. They knew that what they were guarding was more important than their own lives. It was the future. They slowly starved to death, protecting the genetic diversity that their own government had declared a heresy. They died protecting the truth. The story of Trofim Lysenko serves as the ultimate warning. It shows us that science is not just a collection of facts, it's a process, a commitment to intellectual honesty. And it is fragile. It can be subverted when we allow charisma to replace evidence, when we allow political ideology to dictate scientific reality, and when, in our desperation for simple answers to complex problems, we become willing to believe in a beautiful, convenient, and catastrophic lie. It's a lesson that wasn't just true in Stalin's Russia. It is a lesson we forget at our own peril.